Hello, everyone, and welcome to our roundtable today, hosted by Scaleway, Demystifying European Digital Sovereignty. I'm your host and MC today, Chris O'Brien, an American journalist based here in France, working with a number of outlets, including Sifted and the French Tech Journal. We have a great panel today to kind of talk about this big subject, and one that's really become critical and widely debated. So I think we're going to get a lot of great viewpoints today on that. So I'd like to kind of jump right into the conversation. We're going to start first with one of our guests who couldn't be with us live, Peter Ganton, who's founder of Univention GmbH. And we're going to start with a short video from him, just kind of introducing himself and giving some of his thoughts on this topic.
With its data strategy, the German government has brought together a large number of measures already underway and some new ones into a coherent overall framework to significantly increase the use of data based on European values. The most important elements of this strategy are the strengthening of an infrastructure through initiatives in quantum computing and projects such as GAIA-X, the improvement of legal certainty for stakeholders when sharing data, and the advance and exploration of data trustee models. It also aims to strengthen broad-based competencies for dealing with data and to position the state as a pioneer in data sharing. Fortunately, the data strategy also goes further conceptually than previous statements. For example, it opposes the establishment of a concept of ownership for data and wants to enable fair participation in the use of data. This also includes the principle that data generated by public authorities must be freely available. And it can be seen as a paradigm shift that economic interests and innovative strengths on the one hand and data protection on the other hand should not be set against each other, but that both should be driven forward and mutually reinforce each other. This can and must also be done through smart regulation, which ultimately creates security for all parties involved and thereby also fosters a culture for sharing data. Therefore, the data strategy is an important step in the right direction. But the glass is always half full or half empty. Of course, the strategy could have been more ambitious. For example, the obligations to share data for the public sector or to disclose publicly funded scientific data are missing. Within this context, I would also like to refer to the German administration cloud strategy published at the end of last year. In it, the federal and state governments committed themselves to increase digital sovereignty by, among other things, reducing dependencies on individual manufacturers, improving data protection, and increasing interoperability in data use. To this end, software should preferably be used that is open and free of technical or legal restrictions. That means which is open source software, thus enabling the uniform, transparent use of the same solution and the same interfaces by the various public sector bodies. Implementing this strategy will, in my view, lay very important foundations to significantly simplify data protection and data use within the state, while making it possible to create more interfaces for the use of data outside the public sector.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Jan, I want to move to you. Jan Lachelle is Scaleway CEO since just over a year, not quite a year and a half now, I believe. And I've had the pleasure of knowing Jan in a couple of different roles since I've been here in France. Jan, can you kind of give us just a brief overview from Scaleway's point of view on this topic and how the company fits into this discussion?
Thanks, Chris, for hosting this panel. Scaleway, is a cloud service provider, as some of you may know. But I'm going to be speaking both as a, citizen and someone who's been in tech for the past 20 years as an entrepreneur and past 40 years as a user. But basically, my point of view, and that's a personal point of view, is that Europe, and we're going to be talking about sovereignty, when it comes to technology, in particular software technology, Europe lacks sovereignty. So it's not so much defining what sovereignty is, it's actually defining what we do not have in Europe. And that is a matter of fact. Now, I have been spoon-fed by technology made in California, and I actually adore it. But the situation today, as I see it, is that it's too polarized, and Europe is not able to be a true participant in the discussion of what the cloud of tomorrow should be, for instance. And so that is why precisely I joined Scaleway. In other words, Scaleway is a smaller challenger, if you wish, cloud solution provider, where we believe we provide up to 80% of the use cases through our technology. And that puts us in a position to provide some answers to greater sovereignty. It's not a binary situation. It doesn't have to be, and we need to embrace complexity in this matter of fact. So as a person, I do wish to rebalance the current situation, and with Scaleway in particular, Scaleway is a cloud solution provider that can provide an answer, a partial answer, to a rebalancing act.
Great. I want to keep moving on to our list. Next up, we have Bert Hubert from PowerDNS. Bert, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Where are you calling us from?
So my background here is that PowerDNS is a not very well-known company. It's part of Open Exchange, which is a slightly better known company, but still not very well known. But in the background, those companies provide email service and internet infrastructure service to like half of all internet service providers in Europe. And in that there we try to compete, for example, with Office 365. For example, we are one of the suppliers of alternatives to that stuff. And I've been in that business for 20 years. And over that time, I've become, like Jan, worried about our complete and utter lack of digital sovereignty here in Europe, where as it has been noted that it's good to be interdependent on different countries. So it's nice that we get this glorious technology from California. It's nice that we get this cheap and pretty good hardware from China and Shenzhen. That's all pretty good. But the situation where we're now in here in Europe is that we get 100.00% of our technologies from Shenzhen and California. And that is, in the end, not a sustainable situation. And I want to already mention one interesting counterexample. Like 20 years ago, there was already the GPS navigation system. And Europe at that point, and I don't really know why, but they said it's not good that we're all depending on the US GPS system, because the United States Air Force, they could turn that off and then we would not have navigation here. So we want to have a European GPS. And they invested like 12 billion euros in it, and now we have it. And that's actually an interesting example of where you can now get your navigation needs from China, Russia, the US, or Europe. And that's a good situation. That's a nice balanced situation. And one way or the other, I hope that we can move back to such a situation where we can pick and choose technologies and not get all our technologies from outside of Europe.
Great. Thank you, Bert. I want to move next to Aria Turnin, who joins us from Finland. Welcome, Aria. Can you just introduce yourself and give us a little introductory statement about your thoughts on sovereignty?
Okay, thank you. Hello all, also from my behalf, and welcome from super warm Finland. It's a special year for us, and I think this is one of the things that we also need to actually work with the data, because we have so many systemic challenges to beat up currently, which need then very systemic solutions. So I'm from VTT, that's the Technical Research Organization of Finland. We are a non-profit research organization, and participating quite a lot also then the let's say the data sharing and these type of issues. The other hat probably I have on my head for today's discussion is that I'm also participant for the board of directors for GAIAX. As told already kind of before here, I think one of the statements really is that now we need to find out the ways to bring and put data into work and into active use, and by that way then offer good business opportunities for the European companies. So it's not only about the technologies, but it's also then how we share the data and what are kind of the play rules, game rules over there, and what we can work over the joint architecture and also kind of the common practicalities and standardization of the interfaces, so that we can have, let's say, next generation data platforms for Europe and for European growth and business. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. And I'm sure you could have a great chat with Jan about the environmental aspects of some of this. I know that's an issue for another panel, but one that's close to his heart and to the mission at Scaleway. For this first round, I now want to move to our next guest, Jeff Bullwinkle, who's with Microsoft. Jeff, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about, again, we're hearing a lot about this in the context of European sovereignty. Obviously, Microsoft is a global player by its nature for decades now. So if you can give us a little bit of context about how the company sees this topic.
Sure. Thanks very much, Chris. And let me first just be thankful to Scaleway for inviting us to this conversation. It certainly is a topic to think about a great deal. And we're focused very much on the fact that Europe really is working, I think, to define a framework to regulate the digital economy as people embrace technology more and more, particularly in this area of COVID. I'd say that the EU is really leading this initiative globally, raising the standards, if you will, around data protection and around the focus on digital sovereignty in a way that I think will drive economic competition, while also fostering the emergence of tech champions in Europe, including Scaleway and PowerDNS. So I think from our point of view, it's just not necessary, but really appropriate to have Europe positioning itself as driving toward digital sovereignty as a priority, as a means really of protecting citizens and preserving national security and promoting economic growth. I think as the conversation reflects already, and perhaps we'll talk more about this as we go, sovereignty really, I think, is about Europeans being able to control their data. And that control really goes hand in hand with the progression toward things like interoperability, as talked about by some of the previous speakers, changing solutions, being able to use a variety of different technology solutions. Our perspective certainly is that can be achieved through and with the Microsoft cloud. We're doing various things that we hope are contributing to the interests of our own customers and stakeholders across Europe when it comes to data sovereignty and to digital sovereignty. I guess one other thought I would begin with is to say that from our perspective, digital sovereignty really shouldn't be about shielding Europeans from technology outside of Europe. It really, I think, is instead something that perhaps should be based upon a rules-based approach, and one that aligns with the EU's principles and the decades-long commitment to competitive and open markets, non-discrimination, for example, in relation to the support for a digital single market, while at the same time making sure that we're incorporating trusted and innovative technologies from abroad.
Great, and I think that raises some interesting points, Jeff. I mean, we can say this term digital sovereignty, and of course, then it really comes down to the details and how you take an abstract term and make it concrete, and who defines those things. So I think you're right. We want to come back and dig into that a little bit more. To give us a little bit of additional context, I want to come back again to Peter, who has a statement for us, talking a little bit more about the concept of digital sovereignty, how we understand it, and why, in his view, it's important to put it at the center of public policies in European countries.
the way we work and live, how our administrations function, what they can and cannot do, the extent to which we exercise control over the data we generate or can rethink processes and innovate as states, as science or as enterprises, all this is already determined by software and by cloud services and will be even more so in the future. As states, as companies, but also as individuals, we must therefore make sure that we ourselves control the way in which we use digital technology and data, that we can adapt them to our needs and drive them forward with our own ideas and innovations at any time. Otherwise, at some point, it will be exclusively the market-dominating hyperscalers where the data about actions as companies, states or people converge and who can determine whether and under what conditions we can or cannot use which data and in which areas innovation is or is not possible. And we must not forget that the hyperscalers are often subject to the laws of other countries and thus are allowed to use data in a way that is not acceptable to us or have to share it with security authorities of those countries. As a result, such dependency will massively limit the ability of democratic societies to control state action. At the same time, it will significantly threaten the ability of our industry, of SMEs and research bodies to shape processes according to their own needs and to create wealth through innovation. And it poses significant risks to the guarantee of individual rights and freedoms. As a result, digital dependence poses a massive threat both to open democratic societies and to the ability to innovate and create value for the public and private sectors. Digital sovereignty, in contrast, consists at its core of two capabilities. The ability as an organization or individual to determine who accesses self-generated data, when and for what purpose, and the ability to understand and drive digital processes independently of third parties through change and innovation. These capabilities must indeed be at the heart of public action to protect democracy, the economy, and individual freedom. And these concepts are important for Europe, but also for all other regions, countries, and continents. They are not about protectionism or autarky, but about the ability to meet and trade with each other on a level playing field. Stable global trade that benefits everyone will only work in the long term if it does not involve the exploitation of one side's dependence on the other.
So, Jan, I want to follow up with you on that because I know this is has been a big topic since I've known you, since you've been running Scaleway the last couple of years. We have a bit of a concrete example of this with the recent French cloud doctrine that was announced, I want to say just 2 months ago officially, and you've been quite outspoken on this. I know obviously it's a complex topic, but is it possible to just take a minute and kind of summarize what the French government's doing and share some of your thoughts about this notion of a trusted cloud and how this has been defined?
Sure, with pleasure. Basically, the French government took a leap of faith. They decided that the public cloud, in other words, cloud operated by private operators, is the way to build software and services going forward. So the French government went very far by publishing, actually officially a couple of days ago, a doctrine that says that any new project built on behalf of the government, for the government, and for its citizens, needs to be built on the public cloud. And that is absolutely amazing for a country the size of France, given the fact that some of the legacy architecture was getting older and not scalable. If you take the example of a pandemic like the COVID situation, new services had to be created from scratch, literally overnight, with the ability to scale to possibly 60 plus million people, adults, maybe a little less. So this doctrine is actually very important because it's a quantum leap. It forces people to think differently, to adopt new technology that we have, all picked up to some degree. So the US is largely mature when it comes to public cloud, and we have here Microsoft, but also AWS and Google Cloud Platform in the US that are largely responsible for having brought the technology and brought this innovation to a large coherent market that is the US. In Europe, we are lagging behind to some degree again, and then other parts of the world are way behind Europe. That being said, the French government has really made a push for it. Now, we do have criticisms in the way this was presented, but we do also accept the fact that the quantum leap is really progressive, much needed, in fact. Some of the requirements for cybersecurity are, in fact, very good, but the combination does not necessarily solve the question of sovereignty, precisely because of the software component, where we do need to be a little more obsessive with regards to what we're capable of in Europe. So again, the doctrine is very well intended. The timing is very good. It's very progressive. It's very courageous of the government to have tried to align so many things together. Some of the things that were announced at the same time were not quite balanced or quite well thought out, but I think the sequence was hard for them, and they were in a rush to do so. So either way, we're discussing with the government so that some of the key levers can be implemented in a better way.
And Bert, if I can move to you next, when I don't know if you've heard specifically about the French cloud doctrine, but I'm wondering, as you speak from Germany, do you see a difference in philosophy when the two nations are talking about digital sovereignty?
I'll be careful not to speak for the German government because I'm from the Netherlands, but I sort of know what they think. Yeah, there is a big difference. I mean, it's interesting that we're seeing France taking a leadership position here. France has traditionally made some technological leaps. I want to mention Minitel, I want to mention TGV, I want to mention the nuclear power, and I want to mention the Rafale strike fighter. These are very bold French technological initiatives that are really world leading. France is being bigger than itself in a way. It's having a bigger impact and a bigger reach than a country of that size would normally have. If I compare that to the Dutch government as a contrast, we of course are very small. So 17 million people, we cannot take these big leaps because we will always have to work together. And that brings, of course, the European dimension, because if you want to achieve anything at interesting scale, then it's not going to be a French solution or even a French-German solution. It's going to be a European solution. And specifically, if you look at what the Dutch government is doing there, they are taking a back seat on in this stuff. We hear a lot also from Jan from Germany and other places about policy. And I of course, I do policy work. I work for the Dutch government, even not in this capacity, but policy is a good thing. Policy does not drive a web server. Policy does not generate software. And I would love to see some concrete initiatives come up where you say, look, we're going to build this concrete thing. France has now said, look, we're going to move to the public cloud for everything. And I think that is a very good thing. But I would love to see this coupled with initiatives to say, look, we're going to build a European email infrastructure. Very concrete. Because the issue right now is that if I look also at the Dutch government, when they need email, they go to Microsoft. That's the only place they go. And let's say a government or even a very large enterprise would say, hey, I would like to have an email system that is very big and reliable. There is no European choice. No credible one. So there are good partial solutions that are nice. But if you say, look, I want the whole enterprise email solution that has all the compliance things and all the redundancy and all the things that you really need at large scale, I would love us to commit and say, hey, we're going to build that here in Europe, so that we can go to a situation where we can choose. We say, hey, I get my email from Microsoft, or I get my email from Google, or I get my email from EU Mail or whatever. And maybe Germany has the scale to do something like that, but otherwise, France has now done a thing, and maybe the next thing we should do it together and commit to something concrete.
Well, that's an interesting framework. Jeff, I want to jump to you now. It's tricky in these conversations because, I wonder, as you're listening, whether you feel like a company like Microsoft is being painted as a little bit of a boogeyman in some of these things, or how you take those kind of concerns when Microsoft is looking at how to engage with companies in Europe and with European countries. Do you look at something like the French cloud doctrine and think they're targeting us, they're trying to limit what we're doing, or do you see it as something that's constructive?
I would certainly see it as something that's constructive, and appreciate the question, Chris. I mean, what I'd say first and foremost is that we're focused really on trying to develop and deploy technologies in a way that will meet the needs of our customers. But beyond that, be consistent with European values. And this is why, again, you look at what's happening across Europe and in Brussels. There's a new effort to really define digital markets moving forward, and we welcome the regulation where it really is needed. I also just, like others like Jan and Bert, applaud the French government for their own leadership and moving toward an environment that really reflects a kind of cloud-first doctrine and a focus on public cloud as well, as providing a platform for innovation and transformation in France. And I think this is happening across Europe, and that's a good thing. And it's a thing that really will create opportunities, not just for companies like Microsoft, but for European champions too. Again, you have Scaleway here hosting this conversation, and PowerDNS is part of the conversation. You look at this market; it is incredibly dynamic and fast growing, creating lots of choice, I think, for Europeans, and that's really a good thing. I mean, this year alone, for instance, there was about 50% of total IT spending on cloud services. That's a couple of points up from last year, and it's projected that within a couple of years, it'll be 22%. So that's a significant increase over time that we expect to see continuing, and that's going to create a lot of opportunity, a lot of room for European champions to continue developing and growing, and we hope to support that ourselves.
Great. Aria, I want to come back to you. We've mentioned in passing a couple of times GAIA-X. You'd mentioned you're involved in that project. I have a hunch that most of our listeners are familiar with it, but very briefly, can you just describe what it is, and do you think, with your involvement there, that it's been a force in addressing the challenge of European digital sovereignty?
Yes. Well, first of all, kind of the GAIA-X is the association, or ISBL, which is now trying to tackle the challenge how the next generation of the European data infrastructure will be developed. There are different, of course, functionalities and different layers over there, kind of the business layer as well as then the let's say the legal issues, regulations, and technological issues. But that's kind of now the place where we are trying to bring together the businesses, research, and also the governmental decisions, and really to develop next generation data infrastructure, which then ensures kind of fair and rules-based trade for everyone, and which is kind of business driven from the starting point. So that's what it is, and of course it's a huge mission. There is kind of a lot of different type of architectural issues, as I mentioned already, and a lot of different stakeholders, different member states, different type of stakeholders. How to make everything happen, how to bring different bits and pieces together. So it's a huge thing. How to create the standards and make interfaces work together. But I think it's definitely it's the correct step for Europe now to take, and I think at the same time we need a lot of local actions in the member state level, and also even kind of the business level. So different type of use cases needs to be now worked with, where then well, for example, if we think transportation. And again, the climate issues, for example, it's a huge systemic thing. We need to bring very many different players together, and also public data, private data, really to create actually the new business cases, how to actually develop better transportation systems. And we need this type of use cases now, then in order then also then to develop the technological and functional layer and software issues.
Great. And Jan, let me come back to you with that, because I know Scaleway, well, if I remember correctly, was a founding member as well. Do you have any additional thoughts there about GAIA-X or that kind of framework for creating a movement or a setting to address these kind of issues?
Yes, I mean, I see GAIA-X as being a very interesting and German-led initiative at first, precisely because the German players or industrial players were largely dependent on the main cloud operators. And I would say, and I'm sorry that is the case today, but we're going to work on that to rebalance. But most German operators were not working with French cloud operators. So their point of view was to actually work on the data layer, to create an abstraction layer to regain control over those aspects. So that part is critical and remains critical globally, universally, so that there is individual sovereignty in terms of the data that individuals share, that there is corporate sovereignty in the data that is shared amongst corporate unit, and perhaps industrial sovereignty across an industry within a nation or a federation of nations. So that is the initial impulsion of GAIA-X. In the end, GAIA-X, the governance, as Aria can probably attest to, I was part of the previous board and she's now part of the new board. Governance is difficult because the project is quite ambitious, drives many different forces together, but at least I'm pretty sure that we all have pretty strict and clear understanding of what the data part needs to be. As far as the cloud part, it's something that I'd like to talk about later on, which is the notion of multi-cloud. In other words, what GAIA-X also attempts to do is to create some sort of a commodity layer, not by recreating a cloud, but by creating a sort of meta cloud, where things that are interchangeable, things that are a commodity, in fact, in the cloud business, need to be an afterthought. They need to be consumed and swapped at will. So I think that part is really, really interesting in GAIA-X. I hope that GAIA-X will allow delivery on these promises. At Scaleway, we actually believe that multi-cloud also solves part of those issues in terms of interchangeability. In some cases, Jeff is here and I'm speaking to Jeff directly as well. Microsoft has been a champion of technology for the past many decades, and I have my total admiration for what Microsoft has built as a business empire, being able to work with so many partners and generations of technology players, and in some cases, I'm thinking of Azure, but that could be the case for AWS. On the fringe, there are some specific technologies that are pretty unique and extremely powerful. But when it comes to the cloud, be it for the fundamental commodity such as compute or storage, or for some data encapsulation, then clearly we're talking about a commodity. So that is my core point, which is where the doctrine actually makes sense, but the doctrine needs to also build on top of GAIA-X whenever GAIA-X delivers that foundational layer, or on the multi-cloud in a very distributive way. In other words, I do not believe that the main cloud providers have the only answer when it comes to the commodity layer. And that's precisely my point and my my personal fight, if you wish. The commodity layer is something that needs to be more distributive, where actually Jeff mentioned that too. It's good for competition, that there are more providers for that commodity layer so that we can focus on innovation on the top of that commodity layer.
Well, Jeff, let me prompt you on that then. Do you share that sort of analysis in terms of the commodity layer versus the sort of distinct, I don't want to say edge cases, but those more specific higher level technologies in terms of the competitive advantage that a cloud provider like Microsoft Azure offers?
I think Jan makes really excellent points there, absolutely. And I think it just underscore again just how much room there is for innovation, for competition in different layers of cloud services. And indeed, a lot of our customers really are themselves focused on a multi-cloud kind of strategy. And we'd agree as well that GAIA-X could have some interesting solutions for that moving forward, building on what Aria said and Jan said as well about GAIA-X. I mean, this really is, as others have said, a kind of federated initiative that is meant to be building on a foundation of openness, of transparency, and trust. And these are all really, of course, very, very positive things. It's a powerful and ambitious vision, I think, as both Aria and Jan point out, but one we think that really is kind of well suited for this era in which we need to seek in economic growth and prosperity and opportunity that are rooted in digital innovation. And that's why, in fact, we signed up as a day one member of GAIA-X and are very grateful to have a chance to contribute to various working groups and hope to support the success of that initiative moving forward. And we do so with great humility in terms of what any single company can do, but appreciate the fact that it is an open opportunity for us to contribute as well.
Yeah. Well, I'll just make an observation myself. You know, someone who's been covering tech for 25 years or more, it's been interesting to see Microsoft's evolution regarding Europe in particular. You know, going back a couple of decades, that seemed to be a much more tense relationship. And now, you know, see among the big Silicon Valley or U.S. tech giants, it seems to be, I don't know if it'd be completely harmonious, but it seems to be much more engaged and constructive and willing to discuss these things versus, I won't name them, but certain other companies out there that are still see that, I think, as a battlefront for what they're doing. You know, when you look at those regional players and you look at those multi-cloud strategies, then is that the attitude in a sense to figure out, okay, how do we, these things are there, they're existing, these are real concerns that people have there, how do we engage with that?
I'm not sure I'm fully following your question, Chris, sorry.
Well, again, it seems like Microsoft has taken a position where it's, as you're describing, it's a bit more constructive and engaging with these players. So you're not necessarily, you know, out to squash a Scaleway or OVH or one of these other players, but you're engaging in these conversations, you're participating in GAIA-X, you're, you know, talking to regulators about, you know, how Microsoft fits into these things. You know, it seems less.
Absolutely. I mean, look, fundamentally, we are a platform company, and listening to President von der Leyen, for instance, and talking about the need for Europe fit for the digital age, we thought a lot about what the role could be for a company like Microsoft in that vision and realizing that vision, and really, I think, called upon ourselves to think about how we create technology that is fit for Europe, if you will. We talk about that a lot these days, and that really means listening very carefully to our customers, listening very carefully, certainly to regulators, and trying to make sure we are developing and deploying solutions in a way that is respectful of European values and reflective also of the important leadership role that Europe is playing in defining regulation, not just for Europeans, by the way, but around the world. I mean, think about GDPR, for instance. I think we were the first company to say that we would apply GDPR protections for our customers, not just in Europe, but around the world, because it is, after all, Europe setting the bar, and we are determined to meet that bar, and we hope to exceed that bar in a way that is going to be supportive, again, of our own customers' desires for transformation, and that includes not just Microsoft, certainly, but lots of companies across France and across the region.
Yeah, I mean, that's the other observation I'd make is that the influence Europe has had in the 7 years I've been over here, went from a position of being seen as maybe extreme in terms of some of the efforts to regulate the industry to now being sort of a trailblazer in a sense. And you see that conversation shifting in the US as now there's a more robust discussion about what are the rules, what should be the rules around data and privacy and cloud and security. So it's interesting to see that conversation shift. Bert, I want to move to you just to shift the conversation a little bit. You had recently written an article talking about Europe's quote unquote software problem between interdependence and overdependence. We've talked about that a little bit, this notion that that is being here in Europe, we're sort of dependent on so many of these tools that have been developed in the US. Where does that stand now? Do you see any movement away from that now towards a rebalancing of that, or is it still really a situation where Europe is wholly dependent on these tools that are kind of built elsewhere?
No, we're completely dependent on tools being built elsewhere. And I'd like to rain on the parade a little bit. The situation is actually getting worse all the time. And I just first want to clarify that I'm a happy Microsoft customer. So I'm not here to bash Microsoft. I'm a happy Scaleway user also. So please see me as a sort of consumer of many things. But no, the situation is getting worse. And to get to a practical, so just in practical terms, like I said, I can host my email on 2 platforms. If I want to set up a video conference, I have the choice between US software, Chinese software, or US Chinese software. That's the menu. And we are just coming from very, very far behind. And what I'm worried about is that GAIA-X, and I really applaud the initiative and people, they want all the right things, but it's fundamentally an old-fashioned solution. And I need to explain that a little bit. When Europe decided that, look, we needed a GPS space navigation system, they did the thing that you do in that case, and you launch a large procurement, create a consortium, policies, boards, governance structures, very complicated things. And 10 years later, you have the first satellite in space. And in the end, that was very successful, by the way. So I don't want to knock it. It is an example of what you can do if you say we want to have a broader dependence on the whole world, or we even want maybe parts of the world to depend on us. Might also be nice just for the balancing act. But if as a consumer we look at as an entrepreneur, which I also am, if I look at GAIA-X, I would rather host my email with the Dutch tax office than with a big lumbering organization that's being set up as a multinational governance structure. Because I'm in the end not as an entrepreneur, I'm not in the market of for data planes and free movement of data. I'm in the market for nimbly delivered services. And we are getting these nimbly delivered services from Microsoft and from Google and from many other places. And they're very good, really very, very good, because there are sound business models around that innovate. And getting back to our whole regulatory triumphs, and I have to admit, that has been pretty nice. I mean, the whole world is looking at GDPR and realizing that it is an interesting concept that your data is actually yours and not automatically for sale. It's pretty good stuff. But we have to realize that the rest of the world is not quite joining in with such enthusiasm and is still funding a lot of software development by essentially selling data. And what we have done here in Europe, we have said, look, we're going to outlaw the selling of data, but we're going to reinforce that quite spottily. So, for example, you cannot look at a company like Facebook and say that they're actually respecting your privacy, because that's just not their business model. But effectively, through clever means, they get away with that. But we have not. So we have managed to sort of outlaw what they do, but we have not been able, and this is where the story gets slightly more positive and where there are opportunities. So we have outlawed one business model, but we've not found a way to sort of foster a new business model. So so you get a lot of stuff that is subsidized by data moving to all kinds of places, and which is nice, which is very smooth, but we have not replaced that by a European business model. And so we invented the regulatory stuff, which outlawed certain things, but so we closed the door. But with that, we did not open a door. So that's one aspect, and I'd like to another thing that I worry about, but that's maybe a separate thing, but it also needs to be said. This whole data stuff is no explanation for why there is no European Amazon, AWS, because AWS does not sell my data. It does not traffic in my data. It is just a hyperscaler that is extremely good at what they do. And as yet, I have no convincing explanation why no European entrepreneurs took up that gauntlet, with the notable exception, of course, of Scaleway, who are working on that very hard. But there is no policy explanation for why we did not earlier start building Amazons here. And I wonder if government policy is going to create a successful hyperscaler there.
Well, Bert, so there's a few things I want to throw at other people from your statement, but
please.
But first, that makes me, I want to come back to Aria for a second, because on the data piece of that, talking about this question of a business model following GDPR, I know certainly as a journalist, since it went into effect, I guess, 3 years ago now, 4 years ago, I had constantly overwhelmed with pitches from startups saying they're building some business model around these new rules to facilitate it, to leverage it in different ways. Aria, I know you're involved with a project in Finland called the Finland IDSA, the International Data Space Hub Association. Is that, I know just a little bit about that, but can you describe a little bit more what that is? And is that an effort to kind of address Bert's question there about building new models around data?
Well, IDS, sorry. Yeah, you can hear me. So IDSC is kind of, it's a European thing and European association, and one of the hubs is then located in Finland. It has started already a few years ago, and kind of it was, I think, one of the steps how to bring, let's say, more kind of standardization to the interfaces of the different data platforms, and how to kind of create the international data space architecture. So that's kind of the basics there, and then what is then happening is then, I think, again, bits and pieces. I mean, on the other hand, we need to get this technological interoperability to work together and so forth. But then, of course, then we need the real kind of business cases over the data. And now it has been discussed here quite a lot about the, let's say, the technological solutions and interfaces and so forth. What we are, for example, at VTT is trying to support kind of in that development, that's how different companies, by working in the new value chains and in new ecosystems together, what is the new value actually over the data when you cross-use the data? So what is really then the kind of the business case over there? So of course, if there is a single startup company or something else, world is full of technologies to provide. If you're looking for the, let's say, new value chain and systemic innovations, then these data issues need to be solved. And they need to be solved so that kind of, that where my data is and who is using my data, and on the other hand, who else can use then or whose else data I can use. So what is the cross-networked way for the data usage? And what is then kind of then the standardization over there? What are the technological solutions for the interfaces? But most important is that what is then the business model and kind of the new opportunities over there. And these type of local hubs, they can accelerate these type of trials. So we feel we are kind of catalyzers over there, bring different companies together and kind of understand and learn what is the added value when different industrial data is brought together.
No. Jan, I want to come back to you on the second part of, I think, what Bert was talking about, this notion of geography and innovation, and why we didn't see, or at least have not yet seen, an Azure, AWS, or Google Cloud emerge in Europe. Was there, in your view, any sort of regulatory or geographical or cultural limitations that caused that, or do you have a thought about, why that was the U.S. and not Europe?
Well, Bert mentioned a few points that are very salient. One of which is that we are very good at regulating and post factum, but we're not very good at creating economic frameworks to scale some businesses. The US has the Silicon Valley, which has generated probably up to 7 generations of entrepreneurs that have given back to the ecosystem and created gigantic companies helped by venture capital. Europe is probably generations behind as well in that, but also Europe is complicated due to the fact that we have multiple languages to cope for. We have, in some cases, a harmonization at the legal level, and the EU is not quite a federation of states. So these are barriers. If you go back to the French doctrine, for instance, it comes with requirements as well for things that are, say, sensitive data. And so that comes with a qualification or certification type called SecNum Cloud. Now, that makes perfect sense. In other words, we need to increase the level of cybersecurity going forward. But that is a barrier to entry for all of the smaller players. And I'm speaking on behalf of the French tech, all of those startups that want to scale and reach a point of escape velocity. Now, it's harder in Europe precisely because we are highly regulated and at the same time extremely liberal. So while we let other players, say from the US, take on the bulk of the market share, we also create barriers to entry to allow smaller players to emerge and take over or become an AWS equivalent, as we call them, GAFAM, trillion-dollar companies, right? So my concern is precisely, and I'm joining Bert here on this issue, is that we are currently unable to create gigantic companies that can actually bend the shape of the digital future because we are not yet at a point where we have trillion-dollar companies. We're progressing, and in fact, to me, multilateralism at the geopolitical level involves the creation of massive players on every continent, on every federal structure or construct that is able to create a double bind relationship. And in fact, the US is currently looking at antitrust situations when it comes to digital. Why? Because it's harder to decrypt than, say, aviation. Because why? Network effects. Network effects will create complexity in the way you interpret market share. So the US might actually regulate before the EU does so. But I believe that we need to look at it from a non-exclusive standpoint. In other words, once again, in a liberal economy, all of the players from the world are welcome to join in. That being said, we need some more balance to the point where multilateralism exists. And I would love to hear from Jeff about Chinese competitors coming in. Typically, these players are becoming massive, have massive and generous funding from their own government and their own market. So that creates formidable challengers also for Microsoft and AWS and Google. But shouldn't we more think about Europe as an ally in this general sharing of cultural values to reach a point where we are speaking the very same language in terms of competition, in terms of co-petition? I wrote a Tribune on the 4th of July last week, speaking about independence being a two-way street. So it's a complex question. How do we create a giant out of Europe, especially at the platform level? Jeff mentioned platform. Microsoft is a platform and a very good business platform at that for the past many decades. We do need that in Europe to be, again, part of the conversation, to create powerful competition for dominant players today.
Well, Jeff, there's a couple of things for you to address. I want to come back to the China comment in a second, but just to stay with this theme of kind of why US and not Europe at the moment. When I think about kind of the big three cloud players in the US, you guys, AWS, Google Cloud. Obviously, each company had a very distinct journey there to the cloud in terms of its founding, its sort of classic business model, and where it saw the opportunity. So there are some key differences, I think, there. And yet, I think to the point some people here are making, they were certainly sizable businesses in their own right before they became quote unquote cloud businesses. Do you see that? Was that in fact the key that if you can step back just from Microsoft specifically for a second, was that the key really, that these were such big businesses that they had the customer base, they had the resources to kind of move aggressively and a big scale into the cloud? Or were there other factors that you think kind of gave the US an advantage there?
I think it is a combination of things. I think what you say, Chris, certainly has some truth to it, but I agree as well with the comments that we heard from Bert and Jan as well in terms of the environment in the US and the course of decades during which innovation really has been fostered and promoted for a variety of different reasons. I think the challenge, though, is, as Bert indicates, how do you get the balance between regulation that's necessary and appropriate, while at the same time making sure that there is openness and opportunity for innovation and growth. I mean, again, we as a company certainly want to make sure that we support regulation that is a balance, that is measured, that is going to create, if you will, a regulatory floor to avoid, if you will, a sort of race to the bottom. And we do have a lot of concerns about that, particularly as you think about companies outside of Europe, outside the US, that may have a different standard in terms of, for example, the use of data. So we certainly support that regulation, but at the same time trying to making sure that there is an effort to ensure regulation doesn't stifle innovation. I do agree, I want to pick up on what Jan said as well in terms of the opportunities that we have now for Europe and the US to work together in all kinds of new ways for just the reasons that he described. And perhaps I can talk about that with somebody on Bastille Day in a couple of days' time, as he did on July 4th. We were very encouraged by some of the conversation that took place between the European Union and President Biden when he was in Europe not so long ago. And I think that discussion reflected just how much opportunity there is for collaboration between the two continents in this era of ongoing digital transformation, where I think we have the ability to collaborate around shared values. And so I do hope we can move in that direction quickly.
But just to nudge you a little bit more than directly on China, I mean, to Jan's point, does a company like Microsoft, particularly with the cloud, see Chinese companies as a big competitor? I mean, my sense from particularly watching the last few years in the US, there was such a regulatory push by the previous government or the previous administration to sort of limit the ability of Chinese companies to come into the US market. Has that shifted? Do you see them now trying to enter the US market or think they'll be able to? And does Microsoft see them as big cloud competitors?
There's a lot of effort, certainly, as you say, Chris, by a number of companies in China to expand beyond the Chinese market. And that is certainly going to continue. I think there are a lot of reasons why we have concerns about the approach that companies would take from China relative to what we might do in the context of Microsoft. And we hear our own customers are talking about that as well with some level of concern.
I want to shift gears again and talk a little bit about open source software here. I know I believe Peter has a statement for us on the role of open source as it relates to digital sovereignty. I wonder if we can queue up Peter's statement on that.
Open source is the key to digital sovereignty because only the use of open source software makes it possible to fully trace and control digital processes. At the same time, the functioning of software can only be changed and innovatively advanced if the source code is available. Both abilities to review and to shape lead to a considerable degree of control and innovation, and thus are the basis for securing and expanding digital sovereignty. Today's winners of digitization, such as the hyperscalers like Google or AWS, have long recognized this and rely on open source software in an extremely large number of areas to secure the data they and their customers generate and to be able to innovate their own offerings at an extremely high speed. Control and innovation are thus the two core effects of open source on digital sovereignty. But there are many other positive effects, of which I would like to mention just three. First, open, understandable code and the ability to experiment with it are the foundation to learn how to shape the digital world. Thus, open source is also an important foundation for building much needed digital skills in Europe. Second, traceability of processes and data usage when using open source software is at the same time the basis for public trust in software used by states and companies, and thus for acceptance and widespread use of these technologies. This was demonstrated in Germany, for example, last year with the so-called Corona Warn app, which was only viewed positively by almost all critics because its mode of operation was completely comprehensible to everyone. And third, finally, the use and promotion of open source software, especially by the state, creates a digital commons that is indispensable in global competition. It is code that can be used by every administration, every company, and of course by individuals to drive new products and innovations. Open source is thus becoming an essential competition-critical economic asset, and the European Union and member states would do well to strengthen its development and the competence to handle it through their own actions wherever they can.
Great. Thank you for that, Peter. I want to just throw open to everyone here then that question about the role that open source plays in some of the dynamics we've talked about. Again, if I was going to start with Microsoft here, it's sort of one of the amazing things as a longtime observer, the embrace of open source by the company is one of those things that 2 decades ago would have felt unimaginable. But Jeff, do you see that as a powerful force for kind of allowing these sort of collaborative, multi-cloud, cooperative arrangements?
Absolutely, Chris. I think you're quite right to say that this has been a journey for Microsoft over the course of time. And at this point, there's just a great deal of work that we do as a company directly with open source. And I think you know as well, a lot of innovation that happens on Azure that is very much open source based. So warmly welcome all the innovation happening in that space. And thinking again about GAIA-X, as Eddie had talked about that, a lot of the work we're involved in GAIA-X is also open source, and so it's really very exciting to think about what will happen over time, and we will continue to be very supportive of innovation happening in that space.
Aria, let me come back to you on the question of open source. Do you have any thoughts there in terms of the data question or some of the projects that you're involved with in terms of how open source is facilitating or enabling some of those dynamics?
Well, that was now a pretty difficult question for me, but I think the most important thing is, of course, that they are kind of all bits and pieces are kind of work together from the final business case point of view. So there might be open source components and not open source components, and then on the other hand, also then from the data point of view, open data and not open data. So I think it's always kind of some kind of a mixture of different things. But definitely the open source, it's important component in the whole packet.
Yep. And Bert, does that make you optimistic? You sounded a pessimistic note before, but you had a little hint of optimism. Does the growing embrace of open source give you some hope that there is a potential here for Europe to sort of overcome some of these issues we've been discussing?
Yeah, definitely. Because the important thing is in Europe, we're actually very good with open source. So if you look at the open source projects that are out there that everyone relies on, And I mean really everyone. If you go to an iPhone and open the legal screen, or go to any phone and open the legal screen, and like 200 pages of open source components described in there. And an astounding amount of that open source is actually coming from Europe. So we have that talent. And that's hopeful. Also the Dutch government open sourced its entire corona reporting and scanning and QR code infrastructure. That has been very helpful for other countries and also for fixing bugs. But in itself, we actually, in Europe here, if we want to do anything, we are going to have to rely on that open source stuff, because we are being extremely cheap. And this point has been mentioned and raised in the questions of this Livestorm app by my friend Shane Kerr, who said, we should maybe not be too amazed that all this innovation is coming from the US, because they pay their people twice as much money there, even adjusted for living expenses and all the other things. And for myself, look, I've done well, so I'm not complaining from my own perspective. As an entrepreneur, I've done really well. But recently, I was asked to provide some advice on open source and IT matters, and it turns out the rates that were being offered for the legal people in the same room were like 5 times as high that I could charge as a very seasoned very seasoned open source software developer. And even the junior legal people were getting like 3 times more money than I was getting. Now, it's not for me personal to complain, because my money needs are met. But we should not be explained here, not be confused here in Europe, that if we pay bottom dollar, as the saying goes in the US, that our smartest people, our most creative. So the interesting thing is the most creative programmers here in Europe, they work on open source software, not for money. Because it's not really worth for them to start working for a big company, get paid 4,000 euros a month, which is really good money for a programmer in Europe, and then have to live within all these corporate restrictions. So we see a lot of very good European programmers actually working from home, doing their stuff, and they have some kind of other job that pays the rent. But I would love to reverse that situation, that those people continue to do their open source stuff, but that we also say, look, we're going to pay you real money, and so that you can move from your boring finance job or whatever and finally start programming for a living. And we never talk about this, but the difference I got my best programmers from France, because I've been praising France a lot, but you pay your technical people like really badly on average. That was great for me, because I could offer sort of the usual PowerDNS salary, and the French people were super happy. And but we need also to talk. It's not just policy, and the open source stuff is going to help. But I would love to get all this open source talent that we now have working for whatever purposes, and coordinate that in bigger organizations and get them to work on achieving the goals that we'd like to have.
I must counter this. I mean, at Scaleway, based in France, we do pay our people really well.
Nice.
The packages are nice, but that is true. There is a differential between France, the EU, and the US. But in Europe, we do get free education and free Medicare.
The question is more complex, but in a relative level,
yes,
we do value our legal professionals like Jeff, who I value very much, but we value them a lot more than the people so the legal people protect our innovations. And it's good that these are protected, but we spend a lot more money right now on protecting potential innovations than on making them in the first place.
Yeah. Chris, if you may, to me, going back to the question of open source is a lot about value creation, because it does create a common ground for people to build upon, but it escapes the question of value capture. And goes back to the software. In other words, most of the good software models capture most of the value, because selling an extra copy of a license costs literally nothing. So to me, open source is a fundamental part of the commons, where we create a level playing field, because the open source is available to everyone to look into, to get inspired from, to learn, and to build on top of. But it's the very same with all of the common pieces of code or common documentation, such as APIs. So at Scaleway, I talked about multi-cloud, and multi-cloud is what allows an infrastructure provider to actually provide a commodity service, at least at the fundamental layer. So the more open source there is for that layer, the better. And to us, we're pretty agnostic. We pick the very best of what's out there. So when we look at storage, we look at Amazon S3, which is a way to consume storage. But each of us are able to implement it the way we want. So AWS has their way, we have our own way, but it's the same interface. So interfaces, open source, and some sort of a regulatory framework for the foundation. All of that is good actually to create a level playing field. For the containers, we use Kubernetes, which was an offspring of Google in terms of open source. We use, of course, Linux, like any cloud provider. I think Microsoft shifted the strategy for Azure. Tell me if I'm wrong, Jeff, but I think now Azure is largely dependent on Linux. And again, it creates a level playing field. We speak the same language towards the community of developers who will be able to build on top of something they are familiar with. And that contributes to create a level playing field, I think. So open source is just one of the levers on which we depend on, but Bert is right. Someone is paying for it, with their time. And I think the US mindset is better calibrated to take advantage of value capture. In the US, there is a propensity to succeed financially. In Europe, we are configured differently. So the US is able to actually capitalize on something that is freely available, turn it into a business model. Europeans are less good at that, although we're taking medicine to fix that.
Jeff, do you agree with that?
I do agree with that. And look, we've been very impressed by the innovation happening in France, certainly, not just as we're hearing on the call, but more generally and across Europe. I mean, in France, we do a lot of work supporting French startups, for instance, in areas like healthcare, new energies, retailing, and so on. And a number of companies that we've been supporting are part of the French Next 400. Including companies like United, Credit.
Next 40. We only have 40.
Sorry, next 40. Exactly. So a number of companies, and some of those are also building on open source as well. So it is happening, I think, as Jan says, and we're very much supportive of having it happen to a greater degree and faster.
Yeah, I mean, it's. This is a whole separate conversation, but the explosion of open source the last few years, in particular, has been sort of extraordinary. And we've seen, again, from my journalist vantage point, some interesting models evolving to try to bridge that gap that Bert was talking about. That connects particularly those sort of independent, passion-driven developers who have an idea and then suddenly they're overwhelmed with maintenance and all the other things that go along with it. They aren't really equipped to do because they're just doing it out of a love for doing it, to try to connect them to some sort of system that gets them paid or turns it into an actual profession or a full-time endeavor. So I think we're going to see a lot of interesting innovation around the world because open source has just become so fundamental, and you have a giant corporation that depends on some piece of software that's being maintained by some teenager in their bedroom. That's not ideal for anyone at the end of the day, neither for the teenager losing all their nights or the big company. So I think it's going to be an exciting space to watch. I want to remind our listeners we're kind of coming to the end of our time here. We've been kind of weaving in a couple of questions. I know, Bert, you've been kind of watching the question channel a little bit. If you have questions for our panelists, please post them there and we'll get them answered to you. And in the meantime, I want to kind of throw out one general question just for Jeff, one topic we haven't touched on, but Microsoft had a recent announcement about your Blue initiative. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how it kind of maybe applies to this conversation in terms of U.S. jurisdiction and European data?
Sure. Thanks, Chris. And I think there was a reference, really maybe Jan talked about innovation going on years ago in the French civil nuclear industry. And I point to that because you might find some analogy there, because that was a moment in time when France was developing its ultimate leadership in nuclear power in the early 70s with the adoption of the U.S. Westinghouse license. And so there's a parallel, I think, with Blue, as you described, Chris. And what Blue is essentially is an effort driven by our partners Capgemini and Orange, and we're honored to be partnering with these iconic friend companies to form a new company called Blue, and that's a company that's going to be a French entity that licenses Microsoft cloud technology, and the goal is to facilitate the creation of a cloud de confiance that is designed for the French public sector, as well as certain critical infrastructure organizations. And so Blue, ultimately, when formed, is going to implement and manage and control and operate the market for effectively independent cloud services for these particular customers in France. And again, so public sector customers, as well as critical infrastructure providers, essential services operators, and the like. This agreement really is designed to address what are unique privacy, security, and resiliency requirements that are defined by the French state. So looking forward to seeing how this develops over time, and very pleased to be playing a role here. But ultimately, again, it's going to be Capgemini and Orange that create this new organization.
Great. I want to kind of move to one final question, and we'll see if we have more from the audience. But is this question of resilience, because we've obviously been through an extraordinary 18 months with COVID. Unfortunately, it's not really over. But I think one of the technical stories that's been a constant theme is just the embrace of the cloud and the acceleration toward online services, and how dependent we are even more so on this infrastructure that we've been discussing, wherever it's based, whoever it's making. And that begs this question of resilience. Is it really ready to handle the demands that we're placing on it? Obviously, again, we want to deal with this issue of digital sovereignty, but I think, as some people suggested, there's a reason people default to some of these services, because we know they're robust. We know they're easy to use. They sort of have this track record. I think about this even on a personal level in terms of some of the simpler services like social media. They're so easy and convenient to use. It's hard to switch to a competing search engine that may be more quote unquote privacy friendly. So if you all had a recommendation, I'll put this to each of you. I'm wondering if each of you have a recommendation for EU lawmakers about how to sort of balance that, what things they should be thinking about, what policies they should be thinking about to ensure that Europeans kind of have this robust, resilient infrastructure, while also balancing this question of digital sovereignty. And Bert, maybe I can start with you.
Yeah, so my initial suggestion would be, like you said, it's so easy to use the established players. And one of the things that governments can easily do is be a launching customer of any new email or collaboration platform or video streaming platform. It is hard to switch search engine suppliers, but if we want to foster something, the best way to foster that is to be an example, be a launching customer. That will help tremendously. And there is a policy aspect to this, and that is maybe more a European thing, because every government has to do this for itself. But the policy angle is that we have this massive procurement system, which means that if governments want to buy shoes or whatever, literally shoes, when the Dutch Ministry of Defense wanted to buy shoes, they launched a 2-year procurement situation. What is little known is that the European procurement rules are not as strict as people think they are. So, for example, you can do a procurement in which you say, look, we have a trial phase, and any vendor has to go through the trial, and if the trial is good, then we can proceed. And you can even have a jury that measures and says, look, this is a good solution, this is not a good solution. These are ways in which less traditional and less established players that do not have a building full of procurement lawyers will be able to navigate this. And that's one of the things I learned as an entrepreneur is, once you land your first government customer, all your sales efforts go like 12 times easier. Because if you can say, look, I wrote this email solution and it's being used by the Belgian government, your sales efforts are done. It's like, okay, if the Belgian government went for it and they're happy, then I can do it. And this is a thing where the governments could show leadership by opening themselves up to new and alternative platforms.
Aria, let me come to you on that question.
Okay, so I think, well, I'm going to answer a little bit of the maybe architecture and standardization point of view, but sort of kind of make sure that at the same time when the regulations are considered and they are planned so that kind of the standardization and architecture development is kind of European level developing to the correct direction, but not to make it too heavy. So I think the flexibility needs to be, flexibility needs to be there. So the technologies are developing super fast. And so we shouldn't just kind of plan and regulate. We need to be kind of place for the business to develop and really kind of give the freedom over there. And then I think the other thing is, which will be very important, is then the evaluation system. So how to evaluate the development so that social, scientific, and economic bases are all there all the time. Thanks.
Great. And Jeff, what about you? Do you have any kind of words of wisdom or thoughts you'd like to leave EU lawmakers as they kind of tackle these issues?
Sure. I mean, I think echo very much what we heard from Bert and Aria as well. And again, just to comment again on the importance of regulation. Again, very much applaud what we're seeing at the EU level in terms of helping to create this regulatory floor. And GDPR again is a great example of this. I think the regulation now we're seeing develop around AI, around artificial intelligence, is likewise a really good example that will become an example for the world. I think one of the key elements that we have both in GDPR and in the draft AI regulations is this embrace of a risk-based approach. And this kind of builds upon, I think, what Aria was getting at as well. There does need to be room for innovation, and a risk-based approach to these issues of data privacy and GDPR and AI will be important to ensure that the technologies can be embraced, can be adopted, can be built upon over time. And taking again GDPR is just one example. In the wake of the Schrems II decision back in July, almost a year ago to the day, in fact, we've seen a real challenge as customers of ours and others around the world are having difficulty understanding just what can be done in terms of data transfers and data flows. And I think the most recent developments with the new standard contractual clauses from the European Commission do reflect again this notion of a risk-based approach, which after all is also reflected in GDPR itself.
Great. And Jan, I'm going to come to you for the last word on this as our host. Any words of wisdom, thoughts that if you could sit down an EU lawmaker, what would you like to tell them?
Well, I mean, lawmakers make laws and regulations, and we're living in an ecosystem like an organism, if you wish. It's a living and breathing organism, and the dominant players are very good at what they do. Period. If you look at Blur, for instance, it's a technical and legal answer to immediate needs. And so Microsoft is catering to that, and I have no problem with that, actually. I think Microsoft is extremely resourceful in trying to address this their way. My problem, in fact, Jeff mentioned it, but that's not your quote. It's the minister who announced it in France, saying that it would be similar to what happened with a nuclear transfer of knowledge, which I doubt will be the case. So my criticism has to do with this narrow mind view, where, unless, tell me if I'm wrong, but I don't think Microsoft plans to transfer the code source of Azure to France. In other words, I think that my understanding is that it will be operated, and Azure might be operated as well as Office 365 by local partners. So that answers the current concerns, but it does not actually solve the dependency question and the resilience question. We've seen with the pandemics that Europe was largely dependent for masks, for instance. And we also saw that between the US and China, there was a fierce competition led by Trump. And very quickly, almost overnight, the license to Android was withdrawn from Huawei. And so Huawei was suddenly, all of a sudden, unable to operate its own business to sell smartphones. My concern, and of course, it's a scenario, it's almost a disaster scenario. But the concern is that if the US were to withdraw the access to Azure license, cut the cable in any way or form, or decide to take over because Europe is an easy prey by the virtue of the fact that most of the major tech players are in the US, then that would be a problem. So again, I'm going back to my multi-cloud analogy, and perhaps, and this has been voiced around the ecosystem, the notion of a small business act, which in the US was extremely favorable to small and medium-sized businesses. At the time, it was, I believe, and I'm not an expert in US history, but I think it was Eisenhower in 1953, and it was for any sort of businesses. But today, the concern is about small tech business act. In other words, how do we make sure that we create, using public procurement, for instance, which is a major lever, and in the US, we hear about this JEDI contract, which is worth gigantic amounts of money, and being challenged as we speak. So, these things will create giants or reinforce giants, and we do not have such a thing. I was part of a workshop with the Élysée in France called Scale Up Europe, and part of the recommendations was to try and publish, or at least from the large cap companies, publish a percentage of procurement that is geared towards local tech players. And the number is actually appalling. The number today is 0.1%. In other words, established large cap European players, enterprises, are buying European tech to the tune of 0.1%. It's ridiculous. We're not going anywhere with this. So if there is a sort of rebalancing act, it needs to involve absolute willingness to buy local, but I'm not talking binary, right? Again, I'm talking about rebalancing. What if, imagine this, what if Europe were to provide up to 30% of its own cloud demand? That would seem reasonable. And then the ambitious part would be, what if European cloud providers were to capture 30% of US cloud demand and Chinese or South Asian cloud demand? Now, that would be an interesting playing field. And so regulators need to think about that, I think, in terms of market share, rebalance market share, because the market is expanding. The cloud business is expanding to the tune of, next year will be $300 billion and growing at 50% plus per year. There's room for everyone. So I'm actually thinking that regulators do own the levers and the keys to create regulation that will create economic incentive for rebalancing. Again, not a binary situation, and Microsoft is well equipped to address the growing part of the pie, but we do need a level playing field competition.
Great. Well, I want to end there. I want to thank everyone for your time, for the audience for joining us this afternoon. Jeff, Aria, Jan, thank you. Bert had to rush to another appointment. We'll give a distant shout out to Peter. But thank you all for listening. I believe this will be available on replay shortly. So keep your eyes open for that. And again, we look forward to speaking on this further. But again, thank you all for your time and your thoughts this afternoon.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Aria.
Thanks very much, John.